Birthdays used to mean a full table, the house humming with laughter, and the smell of roasted chicken drifting from the oven. Now at 66, they slip by in silence. That morning, I brewed my tea, wrote a few lines in my journal, and watered the rosemary on the porch. The day felt like any other until I heard Matthias's car pulling into the driveway. My son stepped out with a neat parcel in his hands. His visits had grown shorter over the years, his conversations thinner, but he still wore the same polite smile that reminded me of his father. He handed me the box with a quick kiss on the cheek. From Silvana, he said, his eyes already shifting toward the door, as though his errands were louder than my heartbeat. After he left, I placed the parcel on the table. The paper was glossy, tied with a gold ribbon. I took my time unwrapping it careful, as though the paper itself might carry meaning. Inside lay a bottle of whiskey, 18 years, age the kind connoisseurs boast about. The amber liquid glowed under the kitchen light. Once long ago, I might have taken a sip, but after the heart attack 5 years back, I'd sworn off spirits. I ran my fingers over the glass and thought of how little Silvana really knew me. Whiskey was her language of sophistication, not mine. The following evening, the phone rang. Her voice poured through the line, sugary sweet at first. Leocadia, did you enjoy your gift? I leaned back in my chair, steadying my breath. No, I answered, letting each word fall slowly. I gave it to your mother. She loved it. The silence on the other end thickened, stretching so taut I could hear her breath quicken. Then sharp as a whip came her scream. You did what? Her voice cracked a sound not of annoyance, but of something deeper, rawer. My hand gripped the receiver tighter, my pulse rising. In that moment, it struck me that this was not about a bottle of whiskey at all. Something else had slipped into my life uninvited, and it would not leave quietly. The call ended abruptly, leaving the room colder than before. I stared at the half-filled teacup on the table, the liquid gone tepid, and felt the first stirrings of dread that would carry me into the days ahead. The call came just before dusk, when the sky still held a thin streak of orange over the rooftops. It was Matthias, his voice trembling. Silvana's mother collapsed after drinking the whiskey. They rushed her to the hospital in Charleston. The world seemed to tilt. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear, waiting for him to say more to explain, but his words broke into fragments. My stomach turned. I had handed that bottle to Basilia, with a smile, thinking it a polite gesture. Now I couldn't push away the thought. Had I killed a woman with my courtesy? I left a note on the table for no one but myself, and got in the car. The highway stretched endlessly, headlights slicing the dark. Each mile carried me deeper into questions I didn't dare ask out loud. My late husband's voice echoed in my memory. Stay sharp. Leia, truth hides in shadows. I gripped the wheel harder, praying I wasn't about to walk into a truth that would tear what little family I had left. By the time I reached Charleston, morning had barely broken. The hospital corridors smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee. I found Basilia in a bed near the window, her skin pale as paper, her breathing shallow but steady. Relief flooded me when the doctor said she would live, though her recovery would be slow. I stepped close. Basilia's eyes fluttered open, and her voice rasped like sand against glass. The drink, it burned different. Her hand trembled against the sheet as though even the memory scorched her throat. I turned, then my gaze landing on Silvana across the room. Her face carried none of the frantic worry I expected. Instead, she stood stiff, pale, her eyes darting away the moment mine tried to catch them. For the first time, I felt certain this was not accident nor clumsy chance. I sat in the hard plastic chair, the weight of dread pressing on my chest, and realized the question was no longer whether Basilia would survive. It was what exactly had been inside that bottle and who it had been meant for. The morning after Basilia's collapse, a tall man in a navy suit stepped into the hospital room flashing a badge. Detective Clemente Aldama, Charleston PD. His expression was grave as he explained the toxicology results. The whiskey contained traces of white snake root alkaloid, a poison once known to kill entire herds of cattle. A few ounces could stop a heart. I felt the air drain from my chest. That scream of Silvana's on the phone came back to me, sharp and jagged. Basilia had never been the intended target. That bottle had been wrapped for me. Matthias arrived soon after, his voice louder than the truth it tried to cover. It was a mistake, Mama. Some import gone wrong mix-ups happen. But his fingers tapped restlessly on the chair arm, a nervous rhythm he used to betray himself with even as a child. I watched his eyes flicker toward Silvana, who refused to meet mine. Later, when the room emptied and the machines hummed quietly, Basilia motioned me closer. Her voice was a whisper, worn and fragile. Silvana used to come to me for loans, small things, groceries, bills. But now, she swallowed with effort. Now she only asks about your estate, about what will be left behind. Her words pressed on me heavier than any poison. My suspicion tightened, becoming something hard and unyielding. Silvana hadn't chosen that whiskey by accident, nor wrapped it in gold ribbon to celebrate me. She had measured a dose, crafted a gesture, and placed it neatly in my hands. I stood at the window that night, watching the streetlights flicker across the parking lot. My reflection stared back from the glass, older, wearier, but not defeated. Somewhere in the shadows between those lights and that reflection lay the proof I needed. And if I didn't find it soon, I knew the next tragedy would not be avoided. A week later, when Basilia was strong enough to return home, I offered to help her tidy the small bungalow she kept near the marshes. The moment I stepped inside, the sight of that whiskey bottle on the sideboard made my chest tighten. Its golden liquid still shimmered, but when I ran my finger along the cap, I noticed the faintest roughness, as though it had been lifted and pressed back down. Dust clung to the glass, unevenly broken, where someone's hands had lingered too long. I wrapped the bottle in brown paper, my heart pounding, and mailed a sample to Professor Teodoro Science, a friend from my teaching years, who now worked as a chemist at the University of Richmond. I trusted Teodoro's eyes more than the world's, and I needed certainty before whispers turned into accusations. The days waiting felt endless. Each evening I sat at my desk, my journal open, the words blurring under my pen. Doubt gnawed at me, but fear sharpened it. Silvana's scream, Matthias's restless fingers, Basilia's warning. When the phone finally rang, Teodoro's voice was heavy with alarm. Leia, this wasn't contamination. Someone tampered with it. They dissolved a concentrated extract into the liquor, enough to stop your heart within hours. The words pressed against my ribs like iron. I thanked him quietly, though my throat felt raw. There was no mistake anymore. This had been crafted with intention. That night, as I folded laundry in Matthias's old bedroom, I found a pawn ticket slipped in the pocket of his jacket. The date was recent. The item listed a gold watch one that had belonged to his father. My chest ached at the thought. My son pawning his father's legacy piece by piece. Debt was eating him alive. I held the ticket in my hands, torn between grief and fury. Was he so deep in trouble that he couldn't see where Silvana was leading him, or had he chosen to walk beside her willingly? I tucked the ticket into my journal and knew my next step would be to see their house for myself. When I arrived at Matthias's home, he welcomed me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He said Silvana was out shopping, and for a moment, I thought perhaps the quiet might bring us closer. But as he busied himself in the kitchen, I slipped toward the garage, my heart beating with a guilty rhythm. The air smelled of oil and dust, and in the corner, half hidden beneath a tarp, I found them a crate of whiskey bottles, still sealed, their labels too pristine, their arrangement too deliberate. I crouched down, brushing the dust away. Each bottle carried a batch number stamped near the base. I pulled out my phone, photographing them one by one, and jotted the details in my small notebook. It made no sense. Why would they own so many bottles of a liquor they never drank? I shut the garage door softly behind me, the images tucked away like stolen treasure. That evening, after a quiet dinner, I excused myself to the guest room. Through the thin wall, voices carried low, urgent whispers that pierced me more deeply than any shout. She was supposed to drink it by now, Silvana hissed, the edge of panic sharp in her tone. Matthias muttered something, but then Silvana, again clearer this time. Without her house, we're nothing. I pressed my hand over my mouth, the truth striking harder than I had prepared for. The whiskey wasn't a gift. It was a weapon. My son and his wife weren't waiting for me to grow frail and leave them behind something in peace. They wanted to carve out their future from my absence. Later, in the quiet of the guest room, I opened my journal and wrote with steady hand. The knife wasn't in the dark, it was at my own table. I closed the book and set down my pen. My decision hanging between two paths: confront the child I once cradled, or wait for the law to expose him for the man he had become. The following Sunday, I accepted their invitation to dinner. The table was dressed neatly, roast chicken at the center, but tension hung heavier than the scent of garlic and rosemary. I slipped my phone beneath the folded napkin on my lap, recording before anyone noticed. My pulse tapped louder than the ticking clock on the wall. Conversation drifted in shallow circles. Matthias speaking of work. Silvana feigning sweetness as she passed the bread. I let it linger, then placed my words like a stone into still water. Detective Aldama seems very interested in whiskey cases these days. The fork in Silvana's hand froze mid-air. Her smile faltered, and she set the utensil down with deliberate care. Matthias's face reddened. Mama, enough. Drop it. His voice cracked in the middle, more plea than command. Across the table, Basilia, frail, her hands still trembling from her hospital stay, lifted her head. Why would they be interested? She murmured. Her tone puzzled, but cutting. Unless someone wanted to poison you. The silence that followed pressed against the walls. I watched Silvana's jaw tighten, her fingers clenching the stem of her glass. Then she exploded, her voice sharp enough to shatter the air. That bottle wasn't for her. The glass slammed onto the table, wine splattering across the linen. Matthias flinched, his eyes darting between us, desperate to gather the shards of what had just broken free. The room froze in that instant, forks hovering, breaths caught. Basilia's lips parted as if she'd been struck by wind. My own chest tightened, the truth lying bare before us all. I reached for my journal that night with trembling hands, knowing the recording now held more than suspicion. It held words, spoken in fire, words that could not be unsaid. I pressed the pen to the page, the ink bleeding into the paper. She confessed not in shadows, but beneath the light of her own table. And as I closed the book, I knew the next step would not be mine alone. It would belong to the law. Within days of that dinner, Detective Aldama arrived at my door, his expression carved in stone. "We have enough to move forward," he said, showing me the warrant. I followed him to Matthias's house, my stomach a knot. Officers moved in swiftly, carrying out the crate of whiskey I had photographed. The bottles clinked hollowly, the sound of a noose tightening. At the lab, results confirmed what I already knew. Multiple bottles were tainted with the same deadly alkaloid. It was not a single mistake, it was preparation repeated and deliberate. Teodoro's voice crackled over the phone that evening, his tone grave. "Leah, the compound matches extracts from a small herbal supplier near Richmond. Records show Silvana purchased there 6 months ago." His words left no room for doubt. Her hand had mixed the poison. Meanwhile, Aldama slid a file across the table to me. Inside lay a devastating truth: Matthias was drowning. Past due mortgage notices, gambling slips from casinos in Norfolk, even pawn receipts I hadn't yet uncovered. My son had traded stability for desperation, sinking into a tide that Silvana had steered. This wasn't just impulse, Aldama said firmly. It was conspiracy. They needed your estate to dig out. Later at the station, I stood behind the cold pane of interrogation glass. Matthias sat hunched, his hands clasped tightly, eyes fixed on the floor. I searched for the boy who once clutched my skirt in thunderstorms, who asked endless questions about history as I tucked him into bed. All I saw was a man unraveling, trapped between loyalty to a wife and the wreckage of his choices. Fury warred with heartbreak inside me. Every instinct wanted to scream at him, demand why, but my voice remained locked in silence. Through the glass, Aldama's words echoed again: conspiracy. And I knew the time had come when Matthias would have to decide whether to betray his wife to save himself or sink with her into ruin. The courthouse smelled of varnish and nerves, the air thick with whispers and the shuffle of papers. Silvana sat at the defense table, polished as ever, her hair pulled tight, her eyes cold as glass. Her lawyer spun tales with a honeyed tongue, insisting Basilia had been clumsy with her medications, that her collapse was coincidence, not crime. But each lie dissolved under the weight of evidence. The recordings from that dinner played aloud, Silvana's voice cutting through the room. That bottle wasn't for her. Gasps rippled across the benches. The photographs of the whiskey crate, the receipts from the herbal supplier, and Teodoro's analysis of the toxin stacked like bricks in a wall too high to climb. When Matthias was called, his shoulders sagged beneath the oath. At first, he clung to silence, but under the prosecution's steady pressure, he crumbled. Yes, he admitted, voice hoarse. I was drowning in debt. I let her talk me into things I shouldn't have, but I never wanted my mother dead. The courtroom stilled, then cracked with whispers. Silvana turned toward him, her face twisted with fury, eyes blazing like coals. She hissed something only he could hear, but I saw the betrayal strike him like a lash. The jury filed out and back again, their verdict clear, their voices firm. Guilty. Attempted murder. Conspiracy. 30 years. I sat in the gallery, my hands clasped around the journal I had carried through every step of this ordeal. The gavel's echo was meant to be closure, yet it rang inside me as a hollow reminder of what had been lost long before this trial began. Justice is blind, I whispered to myself, but a mother's grief sees everything. And as the bailiff led them away, my eyes lingered not on Silvana's defiance, but on Matthias's bowed head, a shadow of the little boy who once begged me to read him one more story. I left the courthouse knowing the world would demand healing, but my heart remained torn, caught between memory and ruin, unsure if reconciliation was even possible. The weeks after the trial passed in a haze of paperwork and silence. Reporters called, neighbors whispered, but inside my home, it was only me, the echo of my pen against paper, and the ghosts of what had been said in court. One morning, I sat with my lawyer and signed a new will. The house, my savings. The little treasures I had collected over the years, none of it would go to Matthias. Instead, it would form a scholarship fund for underprivileged women in Virginia. If my life was nearly stolen by greed, then at least what remained of it could be used for someone else's beginning. Basilia visited often after that. At first, it was tentative, two women circling around grief, unsure where trust could be planted. But over cups of tea, we discovered a shared strength born from scars. She had survived the poison in her veins, and I had survived the poison in my bloodline. Together, We spoke less of Silvana and Matthias, and more of small things, flowers in her garden, the changing seasons, the taste of honey on fresh bread. Somehow, her presence made the air lighter. In my journal, I wrote, "Peace is not given by verdicts. It is carved from scars." I traced the words with my finger as though they might one day guide me when memory grew too heavy. One evening, I walked along the banks of the James River. The water moved slow and steady, carrying with it fragments of light from the sinking sun. I let the breeze catch in my hair and closed my eyes, feeling the ache of absence where my son should have stood beside me. Yet beneath that ache there was something else, quiet, fragile, but real, the stirrings of peace. I turned toward home, the twilight deepening, ready to face whatever silence awaited me inside. The day of the inauguration dawned warm, the Virginia air heavy with cicadas, yet filled with an undercurrent of hope. I stood on the steps of the small building that would serve as the headquarters of the Montoro Briones Foundation, named for my late husband, Julian Montoro, whose steady hands and kind counsel had shaped my life more than any betrayal ever could. His name, not my son's, would be carried into the future. Beside me, Basilia held the ribbon taut. Her hands trembled slightly, though not from weakness this time, but from the gravity of the moment. At the count of 3, she snipped it clean, and the crowd of students burst into applause. Faces young and eager filled the courtyard, each holding a card with their scholarship award, stamped with the word resilience. I looked at them and felt the strange fullness of giving what could have been hoarded. Each smile, each tear glistening in the sunlight, felt like a stitch mending something torn deep inside me. This was no inheritance squandered on greed. This was a legacy rewritten. That evening, after the last student had gone home and the lights of the foundation dimmed, I returned to my quiet house. I set a teacup on the windowsill, the steam curling gently in the dusk. Whiskey would never touch my lips again, not for celebration, not for mourning. My life had been nearly ended by it, but tonight, tea was enough. I listened to the cicadas hum in the darkening yard, their rhythm steady, eternal. I whispered into the silence as if Silvana might still be listening somewhere behind cold bars. You tried to write my ending, but I chose my own story. I leaned back in the chair, the journal resting beside me, no longer heavy with fear, but lighter with choice. The house was quiet, but for the first time in years, silence did not mean danger. It meant survival.